The morning sun was just beginning to cast long shadows across the pavement. But inside the upscale coffee shop, the air was already buzzing with the frantic energy of the city. It was the kind of place where the coffee cost as much as a full lunch, and people sat in corners tapping away on laptops, pretending to be more important than they probably were. The smell of roasted beans mixed with the scent of expensive perfume and fresh pastries, creating a thick atmosphere that felt heavy and hurried. Near the back of the long line stood a woman named Clara. She didn't look like she belonged in a place like this, at least not in the eyes of the people standing around her. She was wearing a simple, worn-out coat that had seen better days. Her shoes were practical scuffed boots meant for walking, not for making a fashion statement. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she held a small, cracked leather wallet in her hands. She looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from working long hours and worrying about things that money can't always fix. Clara was just trying to buy a cup of coffee, perhaps a small treat to cheer herself up. She had a long day ahead of her, and she needed the caffeine to keep going. When it was finally her turn to order, she stepped up to the counter with a shy smile. The barista, a young man with a tired expression, waited for her to speak. "Could I please have a small black coffee, and maybe one of those blueberry muffins?" Clara asked softly. Her voice was gentle, barely audible over the hissing of the espresso machine behind the counter. "Sure thing," the barista said. "That will be $6.50. Clara nodded and opened her wallet. She didn't use a fancy credit card or tap her phone. Instead, she began to count out crumpled dollar bills and a handful of quarters. It took her a moment to find the right amount. She was careful, making sure she had enough, her fingers moving slowly through the small pile of money. It wasn't that she didn't have the money. It was just that every cent mattered to her. She wasn't careless with her resources. Behind her, the line was growing. A man in a sharp, tailored suit let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, checking his expensive gold watch as if he were timing a bomb that was about to go off. This was Thomas. Thomas was a man who believed that his time was the most valuable resource on the planet, and anyone who wasted it was committing a crime against him personally. Thomas was used to getting what he wanted, and he wanted his coffee now. He was a wealthy real estate developer, or at least that's what he told everyone at parties. He had the look of a man who spent more time in front of a mirror than he did doing actual work. His suit was perfectly pressed, his hair was gelled into precise submission, and he carried an air of arrogance that seemed to repel the people around him. "You've got to be kidding me," Thomas muttered, loud enough for everyone in the front of the line to hear. "I haven't got all day to watch someone count pennies. Some of us actually have jobs to go to." Clara flinched at the sound of his voice but didn't turn around. She quickly placed the coins on the counter. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the barista. "I'm almost done." The barista gave her a sympathetic look but didn't say anything, knowing that getting involved would only cause more trouble. He swept the money into the register and began to make her coffee. Thomas wasn't satisfied with just a sigh. He took a step closer, invading Clara's personal space. He leaned in, hovering over her shoulder like a dark cloud. "Look," he said, his voice sharp and condescending. "This is a premium establishment. If you can't afford to pay without holding up the line, maybe you should go to a diner down the street. They probably have a special for people like you." A few people in the shop turned to look. Some looked away awkwardly, staring at their phones or the floor. Others watched with a mix of curiosity and discomfort, but no one said anything. Thomas felt powerful in this silence. He enjoyed the fact that he could dominate the room. Clara turned around slowly. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. There was no anger in her gaze, just a quiet sadness that seemed to unsettle him. She held her ground, even though he was a head taller than her and dressed like $1 million. "I'm just buying a coffee," she said simply. "I have the money. I'm just being careful. Careful." Thomas laughed, a short barking sound. "You're holding up the progress of society, lady. Time is money. And frankly, you're wasting mine." He gestured at her coat. "And maybe dry clean that thing once in a while. It's distracting." The barista set the cup of coffee and the muffin on the counter. Clara reached out to take them, but Thomas didn't move back. He blocked her path, forcing her to squeeze past him. As she tried to slide by, he made a show of pinching his nose as if she smelled bad. "And wash up while you're at it," he added with a nasty smirk. "Hygiene costs nothing, but apparently you missed that memo." The insult hung in the air like a bad smell. Clara didn't respond. She grabbed her coffee and the small paper bag with her muffin. Her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the effort it took to keep her composure. She knew that if she said anything, it would only make him worse. Bullies like Thomas fed on reactions, and she refused to give him that satisfaction. She walked away from the counter, her head held high, looking for a place to sit. The only available seat was a small, wobbly table near the window. She made her way through the crowd, feeling the eyes of the customers on her. She felt small, but she kept walking. She placed her cup on the table and sat down, trying to ignore the murmurs that rippled through the room behind her. At the counter, Thomas finally stepped up. He smoothed down his suit jacket, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He flashed a charming smile at the female barista who had just taken over the register, expecting her to be impressed by his display of dominance. "I'll have a triple espresso," he said, his voice booming now that Clara was gone. "And make it quick. I've got a meeting with some very important people." The barista looked at him, her face blank. She didn't smile back. "That will be $5. Thomas tapped his card on the reader without waiting for the total. He didn't even look at her. He was too busy looking around the room, making sure everyone had seen him put that woman in her place. He felt a rush of adrenaline. In his mind, he was the hero of this story. He was the successful man enforcing the rules of a civilized society. He believed that people who didn't dress well or move fast enough deserved to be reminded of their place. He grabbed his cup and turned around, looking for a seat. He expected to find the best table in the house open for him, the one by the window with the plush chair. But instead, he saw Clara sitting there. She wasn't looking at him. She was carefully unwrapping her muffin, treating the cheap pastry like it was a delicacy. Thomas felt a spark of irritation again. Why was she still here? Why was she ruining the vibe of the place with her presence? He considered walking over to her table and saying something else, just to make sure she really understood the message. He wanted her to leave. He wanted her to feel so unwelcome that she would never come back. He took a sip of his espresso, burning his tongue slightly, and cursed under his breath. The day wasn't starting the way he wanted. He felt like he had won the battle, but the war wasn't over. He stood there for a moment, scanning the room, his eyes finally landing back on Clara. She took a bite of her muffin and looked out the window at the busy street. She seemed peaceful, which only annoyed him more. How dare she be peaceful? Thomas thought. She should be embarrassed. She should be apologizing to everyone in this room for wasting their time. Instead, she acted like she belonged there. It was insulting. He decided then and there that he wasn't going to let her enjoy her morning in peace. He was going to make sure she regretted walking into his territory. With his coffee in hand, he straightened his tie and began to march across the room, his polished shoes clicking loudly on the tiled floor. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the coffee shop, signaling to everyone that something was about to happen. The other customers watched him approach Clara's table. Some shook their heads, others pulled out their phones to record, sensing a confrontation. Thomas didn't notice the phones. He only saw his target. He was blinded by his own ego. He was convinced that he was the main character and everyone else was just a background extra in his movie. He had no idea that in a few moments the script was going to flip completely. He was walking toward a cliff, but he was too busy looking down on others to see the edge right in front of him. Thomas didn't slow down as he crossed the room. He walked with a deliberate, heavy stride, the kind meant to announce his arrival and warn others to get out of the way. He held his expensive espresso cup like a weapon, or perhaps a trophy of his superior status. The closer he got to the small corner table near the window, the more his confidence seemed to swell. In his mind, he wasn't being a bully. He was teaching a lesson. He honestly believed that by making this woman feel small, he was somehow upholding the standards of the establishment. The woman, whose name was Alina, sat with her back mostly to the room. She had taken a bite of her muffin and was chewing slowly, savoring the sweetness. She had her hands wrapped around the warm paper cup, letting the heat seep into her cold fingers. She was aware of the footsteps approaching, her loud, sharp, and arrogant, but she didn't turn around. She hoped that if she ignored him, he would just keep walking, or maybe take a hint and leave her alone. But she knew deep down that men like Thomas rarely take hints. Thomas stopped right at her table, looming over her. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment, waiting for her to look up and acknowledge him. When she didn't react immediately, he let out a loud, annoyed huff. "You know," Thomas started, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "I thought that little scene at the register would have been enough to send you on your way." Elena took a sip of her coffee before she slowly turned her head to look up at him. She didn't look angry. She didn't look scared. She just looked at him with a kind of calm curiosity, as if he were a child throwing a tantrum in a supermarket. This calmness threw Thomas off guard. He was used to people either cowering in fear or shouting back in anger. He didn't know how to handle indifference. "Excuse me," Elena asked quietly. Her voice was steady, contrasting sharply with his aggressive tone. "I said, I thought you would have left," Thomas repeated, crossing his arms over his chest. "This isn't a library, and it certainly isn't a soup kitchen. People come here to do business, to network. You're blocking the view with your stuff." He gestured vaguely at her worn coat and the few coins sitting on the table. Elena glanced at her things, then back at him. She realized then that he wasn't just impatient. He was cruel. He enjoyed this. He wanted to see her squirm. "I paid for my seat just like everyone else," Elena said softly. "I'm not hurting anyone. I'm just enjoying my breakfast." Thomas let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. He leaned down, placing both hands on the table, bringing his face uncomfortably close to hers. He wanted to intimidate her. He wanted her to smell his cologne and feel his breath on her face. "You see, that's where you're wrong," he hissed. "By being here, by dressing like that, by taking up space that could be used by someone who actually contributes to society, you are hurting people. You're lowering the tone of the place. It's embarrassing for the rest of us to have to look at poverty while we're trying to enjoy our morning." A few people nearby stopped talking. The man with the laptop at the next table closed his lid slightly to hear better. Two women in the corner stopped whispering and stared openly. The tension in the shop was thick now, like a storm cloud rolling in. The baristas behind the counter paused, cleaning cups slowly, their eyes darting nervously toward the confrontation. Elena felt a wave of sadness wash over her. Not for herself, but for him. She looked at his expensive suit, his perfectly styled hair, and his watch that probably cost more than her car. He had everything a person could need to be comfortable, yet he was miserable. He was so insecure that he had to pick on a stranger just to feel big. "You seem very angry," Elena observed gently. "Maybe you should sit down and have some coffee. It might help you relax." Thomas straightened up as if he had been slapped. His face turned a shade of red that clashed horribly with his pastel tie. How dare she suggest he sit down with her? The audacity of it made his blood boil. "I don't want to sit with you," Thomas snapped, his voice rising an octave. "I want you to leave. I'm actually important. I have a meeting coming up. I can't have a key investor walk in and see someone who looks like they just came from a homeless shelter sitting in the prime spot. It's bad for business. Now, pack up your crumbs and get out." He reached out as if to grab her coat to physically move her things, but he stopped just short of touching them. He knew that touching her might be crossing a line that even he couldn't smooth over with a lie later. Elena looked at his hand hovering over her coat. She slowly reached out and moved her cup to the side, protecting her space, but she did it without rushing. She looked him straight in the eye, and for the first time there was a spark of steel in her gaze. "You have a very expensive suit," Elena said, her voice clear and firm, "and a very nice watch. But you know what they say? You can dress a man in silk, but if he acts like a pig, he's still just a pig in silk." The silence that followed her statement was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. The man with the laptop let out a barely audible whoa. Even the baristas stopped moving. Thomas stood frozen. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. He was stunned. No one talked to him like that. No one. He felt his ego bruise, swelling up painfully. "How dare you?" Thomas finally sputtered, his face purple now. "Do you know who I am?" I could buy this place. I could buy you. Alina stood up slowly. She wasn't very tall, but she carried herself with a dignity that made her seem taller than she was. She picked up her muffin wrapper and tossed it into the trash can next to the table. I don't care who you are, she said, looking at him with pity now. Money can buy a suit, Mr. Thomas. It can buy a fancy watch. It can even buy you a coffee at a shop like this. But it cannot buy you class. And it certainly cannot buy you manners. You are a very poor man, regardless of what is in your bank account. She picked up her cup and moved past him, leaving him standing there by the empty table, fuming and humiliated. She didn't storm off in anger. She didn't run away crying. She just walked away with her head held high. Taking the high road as the rest of the room watched her go, Thomas stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving. He looked around the room expecting people to laugh, to side with him, to agree that she was crazy. But he saw none of that. He saw judgment. He saw people shaking their heads. He saw the baristas looking at him with disgust. Can you believe that woman? Thomas shouted to the room, trying to regain control of the narrative. She's crazy. Totally out of her mind. Nobody answered. The man at the next table opened his laptop back up and pretended to type, effectively ignoring Thomas. The women in the corner turned their backs to him. Thomas felt the heat rising in his neck. He had one, hadn't he? She had moved. She was leaving the area. So why did he feel like he had just lost a fight he didn't even know he was in? He tried to smooth his hair, his hand shaking slightly. He took a gulp of his espresso, but it had gone cold and bitter. He wanted to slam the cup down, but he didn't want to look even more unhinged. He grabbed his phone, checking the time frantically. His meeting was in 20 minutes. He needed to compose himself. He needed to forget about the crazy woman in the worn coat. He walked toward the large glass window, putting his back to the room, and looked out at the street outside. The city was waking up properly. Cars were honking, people were rushing to work. The world was spinning. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to inflate his chest back to its usual size of self-importance. He told himself that she was nobody. Just a nobody who would never be anything. He told himself he was the king of this castle. But the silence inside the shop was loud. It was a heavy, accusing silence that seemed to press against his back. He felt the eyes of the baristas burning into him. For a man who thrived on attention, this kind of attention was suffocating. He realized that his attempt to assert dominance had completely backfired. Instead of looking powerful, he looked small, petty, and mean. He checked his reflection in the window. He fixed his tie. He forced a smile, practicing his business face for when his guest arrived. But the eyes looking back at him in the glass seemed hollow. He straightened his jacket one last time, ready to put the incident behind him, unaware that the woman he had just insulted was about to re-enter his life in a way that would shatter his reality completely. He stood by the window, waiting, a lonely king ruling over a room full of people who couldn't stand him. The heavy silence in the shop was getting to Thomas. He was used to noise, chaos, and the sound of his own voice filling the room. This quiet judgment was something he didn't know how to handle. He paced a small circle near the window, checking his watch every 30 seconds. He tapped his foot on the polished floor, creating a rhythmic annoyance that anyone nearby could hear. But no one acknowledged. He tried to convince himself that he didn't care what a bunch of strangers thought. They were just nobodies, people drinking coffee while he was out there making deals and building skylines. He smoothed his hair again, a nervous habit he couldn't shake. He needed to get back into his zone. He needed to feel powerful again. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails, not really reading them, just wanting to look busy and important. Just as he was about to pocket the phone in frustration, the heavy glass door of the coffee shop swung open. A small bell above the door chimed, cutting through the thick atmosphere. Thomas didn't look up immediately. He assumed it was just another student or another worker coming in for a caffeine fix. But the mood in the room shifted instantly. It wasn't just the sound of the door. It was the energy that walked in with it. Thomas felt a change in the air and looked up from his screen. Walking in was an older man, probably in his late 60s. He didn't have the frantic, aggressive energy of Thomas. Instead, he moved with a calm, slow purpose. He was dressed impeccably, but not in a flashy way. His coat was a classic wool trench, and he wore a scarf that looked like it was made of the finest cashmere. He had white hair swept back neatly and walked with the help of a polished wooden cane, though he didn't seem to lean on it heavily. He looked like he owned everything he touched. Thomas froze. His eyes went wide, and his mouth opened just a little. He recognized that face immediately. It was Mr. Sterling. To the general public, the name might not ring a bell. But in Thomas's world, Mr. Sterling was a giant. He was the owner of the city's largest private bank and a silent partner in almost every major real estate development in the city. Thomas had spent the last 6 months trying to get a meeting with this man. He had called, emailed, and even sent flowers to Mr. Sterling's secretary, all to no avail. He needed a loan for his new project, a massive skyscraper downtown. And without Mr. Sterling's backing, the whole thing was going to collapse. This was it. The opportunity Thomas had been praying for. The universe was finally giving him a break. He completely forgot about the woman in the corner. He forgot about the judgmental silence. All he could see was the golden ticket standing by the entrance. Taking off his leather gloves, Thomas straightened his posture instantly. He sucked in his stomach, buttoned his suit jacket, and pasted on his best business professional smile. It was a smile he had practiced in the mirror 1,000 times, confident, charming, and just a little bit humble. He felt the adrenaline rushing back. This was his moment to shine. He was going to wow Mr. Sterling right here in the coffee shop, charm the old man, and maybe even walk out with a handshake on the deal. "Mr. Sterling," Thomas called out, his voice booming across the room, perhaps a little too loudly. What a pleasant surprise. He started marching toward the entrance, his hand extended. He was ready to introduce himself, assuming that the man would recognize his name immediately. Thomas was so focused on his own target that he didn't notice the rest of the room's reaction. The baristas perked up. The customers stopped whispering. Even the man with the laptop looked up, but Mr. Sterling didn't look at Thomas. The older man didn't even seem to hear him. He took off his coat and handed it to a young employee who rushed forward to help him. A privilege reserved for VIPs. Mr. Sterling then smoothed his sweater and looked toward the back of the room. His eyes, sharp and blue despite his age, scanned the faces until they landed on the small table by the window. Thomas was about 5 steps away from him, closing in fast. He was confused. Why isn't he looking at me? Thomas thought. I'm right here. He kept walking, ready to step into the older man's line of sight. Then something happened that made Thomas stop dead in his tracks. Mr. Sterling's face lit up. It wasn't a polite, fake smile for a stranger. It was a genuine, warm smile, the kind you see when a grandfather spots his favorite grandchild. The stern banker look vanished, replaced by pure affection. Mr. Sterling bypassed Thomas completely. He walked right past the outstretched hand. He walked past the expensive suit. He walked past Thomas as if he were a coat rack standing in the hallway. Thomas stood there with his hand hanging in the air, feeling a cold breeze sweep over him. He turned around, stunned. Watching as Mr. Sterling made a beeline for the corner table, Thomas felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. Who was back there? Who could possibly be more important than a man with $1 million deal waiting? Mr. Sterling walked up to the small table where the woman in the worn-out coat was sitting. Alina was just finishing her coffee. She looked up as the shadow fell over her table. Thomas expected her to look surprised or maybe scared, but she didn't. She just smiled. "Hello, darling," Mr. Sterling said softly. His voice carried a warmth that Thomas had never heard before. "Hello, Dad," Alina replied, standing up to give him a hug. The silence in the coffee shop shifted instantly. The judgment that had been pressing down on Thomas was now lifting, replaced by a collective wave of shock. The man with the laptop almost dropped his coffee. The baristas whispered to each other, their eyes wide. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Thomas felt his knees get weak. He gripped the back of a nearby chair to steady himself. "Dad?" The word echoed in his mind. The woman he had mocked. The woman he had insulted for being poor. The woman he had told to leave because she was lowering the tone of the place. Was the daughter of the richest, most powerful banker in the city? Mr. Sterling kissed Alina on the cheek. "I hope I didn't keep you waiting too long." The The traffic on Fifth Avenue was a nightmare. No, I was just enjoying the quiet, Elena said. Actually, it wasn't that quiet. I had a little run-in with a man who was very unhappy with my coat. Mr. Sterling pulled back, his face turning serious. He looked at his daughter, his protective instincts kicking in. Is that so? Yes, Elena said calmly. He told me I was lowering the tone of the establishment. He seemed to think I didn't belong here. Thomas wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He wanted to become invisible. He slowly lowered his hand. Realizing that the hand he had offered to Mr. Sterling was the same hand he had used to gesture rudely at the man's daughter only minutes ago, Mr. Sterling looked around the shop, his eyes narrowing. He sensed the tension in the room. He noticed the way the other customers were looking, toward a spot near the counter exactly where Thomas was standing, frozen. The older man turned slowly, following their gaze. He saw Thomas standing there, pale as a ghost, looking like a deer caught in headlights. Mr. Sterling's expression didn't change to anger. Instead, it became cold and calculating. He looked Thomas up and down, taking in the flashy suit, the panicked eyes, and the arrogant posture that was now crumbling into shame. Mr. Sterling didn't need an introduction. The scene had already played itself out before he arrived. He knew exactly who this man was. Is that him? Mr. Sterling asked his daughter, though he kept his eyes locked on Thomas. Elena nodded slowly. That's him. He was very adamant that people like me don't belong in the same room as people like him. Thomas tried to find his voice, but it was gone. His throat felt like it was full of sand. He thought about running. He could just turn around and run out the door. He could leave the city. He could change his name. Anything but stand here and face the consequences of his own cruelty. But his feet were glued to the floor. He watched as Mr. Sterling patted Elena's arm gently, whispering something to her that made her smile slightly. Then, the banker turned his full attention to Thomas. He didn't walk over to him. He didn't need to. His presence was powerful enough to bridge the distance. I believe you were trying to get my attention, Mr. Sterling said, his voice calm but cutting through the air like a knife. I've received your emails, Mr. Thomas. I've heard your messages asking for a meeting to discuss your new project. Thomas nodded weakly. Yes, sir. I was just coming over to say hello. Mr. Sterling raised an eyebrow, a small, cynical smile touching his lips. Well, you have certainly introduced yourself today. You've shown me exactly the kind of man you are. Thomas started to sweat. The expensive shirt he was wearing felt suddenly very hot and suffocating. Sir, I didn't know who she was. If I had just known— Mr. Sterling interrupted, holding up a hand to stop him. That is the problem, isn't it? You only respect people if you think they can do something for you. If you think they have money or power or a title, if you think they are just a simple woman in a worn coat, you treat them like dirt. The room was deadly silent. Every single person was holding their breath. This was better than any movie they had ever seen. The bully was being cornered. There was no way out. Mr. Sterling took a step closer to Thomas, leaning slightly on his cane. I judge character by how a person treats those who can do nothing for them. And by that measure, you are a very poor man, Mr. Thomas. Your suit costs more than most people make in a month, but your behavior is bankrupt. Thomas felt the tears of humiliation stinging his eyes. He looked around for help, but found none. The baristas were shaking their heads. The customers were looking at him with disgust. He was alone, completely and utterly alone, standing in the middle of the shop that he had tried to rule only minutes ago. He had spent his whole life trying to climb to the top, only to realize that he had dug his own hole the moment he opened his mouth. The silence in the coffee shop was heavy, pressing down on Thomas like a physical weight. He stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, gasping for air on the riverbank. The few seconds that passed felt like hours. He could feel the sweat trickling down the back of his neck, soaking into his expensive collar. He looked at Mr. Sterling, hoping to see a sign of forgiveness, or maybe even a hint that this was all a bad joke. But the older man's face was a mask of calm, cold stone. There was no humor there, only a quiet, piercing disappointment that stung much worse than shouting ever could. Mr. Sterling didn't look away. He kept his eyes fixed on Thomas, waiting for him to speak. When Thomas couldn't find any words, the older man sighed softly, a sound of weary resignation. He adjusted his grip on his cane, the wood tapping softly against the floor. "You see," Mr. Sterling said, his voice steady and clear, projecting across the room without him needing to shout, "I have spent my life building my reputation. I didn't build it by wearing expensive suits or driving fast cars. I built it by keeping my word. And most importantly, by treating people with respect regardless of who they are or what they have in their bank account." Thomas swallowed hard, his throat feeling like it was full of sand. He tried to force a smile, a pathetic, trembling attempt to charm his way out of the hole he had dug. "Mr. Sterling, sir," Thomas finally managed to squeak out. I think there has been a terrible misunderstanding. I didn't know who she was. If I had known she was your daughter, I never would have said those things. You have to believe me. I was just stressed about the meeting. I wanted everything to be perfect." He was rambling now, throwing excuses at the wall, hoping one would stick. "I respect you, sir. I respect everything you've built. I wanted to partner with you because you are the best. I made a mistake. A stupid mistake." Mr. Sterling listened, his face unreadable. He let Thomas stumble through his sentences, watching him squirm. Then, he held up a hand to silence him. "The problem isn't that you didn't know who she was," Mr. Sterling said, his voice dropping an octave, coming softer, but somehow even more dangerous. "The problem is that you thought it mattered." Thomas blinked, confused. I don't understand. It shouldn't matter if she is my daughter, or the woman who cleans the floors, or the CEO of a company," Mr. Sterling continued. "She is a human being. That should be enough to earn your basic decency. The fact that you only care now because you realize she has power and money, that tells me everything I need to know about your character." He took a step closer, closing the distance between them. Thomas instinctively took a step back, bumping into a small round table. The cups on it rattled. "You wanted a loan for your new skyscraper," Mr. Sterling said. "You wanted my bank to back your project? You want me to trust you with millions of dollars?" "Yes, sir," Thomas whispered, his eyes wide with desperation. "It's a great project. The numbers are solid. I can show you the projections right now." "I don't care about the numbers," Mr. Sterling said sharply. "Numbers can be faked. Projections can be manipulated. But character? Character is constant. You showed me your true character today, Thomas. And it is ugly. It is arrogant. It is cruel." The words hit Thomas like physical blows. He felt the blood drain from his face. His knees felt weak, and he had to grab the edge of the table to keep from falling over. He looked past Mr. Sterling, toward the corner where Elena was sitting. She wasn't looking at him. She was calmly drinking the last of her coffee. Seemingly detached from the destruction of his career happening just a few feet away. "I cannot," Mr. Sterling said, enunciating every word clearly in good conscience, "do business with a man who treats people the way you treated my daughter. And to be honest, I wouldn't want to be associated with such a man. You are a liability, Thomas. You are an accident waiting to happen." Thomas felt his world crumbling. The loan was everything. Without the backing of Sterling's bank, the other investors would pull out. The project would die before it even broke ground. His reputation in the city would be ruined. If word got out that he had been blacklisted by the biggest name in the industry, no one would touch him. "Sir, please," Thomas begged, his voice cracking. He was no longer the arrogant bully. He was just a scared man fighting for his life. "Don't do this. I can change. I'll apologize. I'll buy her a new coat. I'll pay for her coffee for a year. Just give me a chance." "You cannot buy your way out of this," Mr. Sterling said firmly. "This isn't a transaction. This is about who you are. And frankly, I don't like what I see." Mr. Sterling turned his back on Thomas. It was the ultimate dismissal. It was as if Thomas had ceased to exist. The older man walked back to his daughter's table, his movements smooth and dignified. He placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. Leaning down to whisper something in her ear, Thomas stood frozen in the middle of the shop. The humiliation was absolute. He looked around the room, hoping for a miracle. But he saw only cold faces. The baristas were watching with satisfaction. The customers were whispering, their eyes filled with judgment. He saw a man in the corner actually filming him with his phone. Thomas instinctively raised his hand to cover his face, but he knew it was too late. His shame was going to be viral by the afternoon. "Come, Alina," Mr. Sterling said gently. "Let's go somewhere else for breakfast." "The air in here has become unpleasant," Alina nodded. She stood up, gathering her worn coat and her simple wallet. She walked past Thomas without even glancing at him. She didn't look angry. She didn't look vindicated. She didn't look at him at all. He was beneath her notice as she walked by. Thomas flinched, expecting her to say something, maybe to gloat, but she just kept walking, following her father toward the door. It was as if he were a piece of furniture she had to walk around. The indifference hurt more than any insult could have. It showed him just how insignificant he really was. Mr. Sterling paused at the door, his hand on the handle. He looked back at the baristas. "My apologies for the disruption," he said politely. "Put everyone's drinks on my tab?" The baristas nodded and thanked him. Then, with a final look of disgust in Thomas's direction, Mr. Sterling held the door open for his daughter, and they walked out into the morning sun. The bell above the door chimed again as it closed behind them, signaling the end of the scene. Thomas was left standing alone in the sudden quiet. The adrenaline that had been keeping him upright began to fade, replaced by a crushing wave of exhaustion. He looked down at his expensive suit. It suddenly felt like a costume. It felt like a lie. He had spent so much money trying to look like a winner, but in just 10 minutes, he had proven to everyone in the room that he was actually a loser. He looked at the counter. The young barista who had served Alina was wiping down the counter, staring at Thomas. The barista didn't say anything, but his expression said it all. "Get out." Thomas didn't order his espresso. He didn't sit down. He knew he wasn't welcome here anymore. He put his head down, clutching his briefcase like a shield, and walked toward the door. He could feel the eyes of every single person in the shop boring into his back. He could hear the whispers starting up again as soon as he moved. "Did you see that? Totally deserved it. Who does he think he is?" He pushed the door open and stepped out onto the street. The cool air hit his face, but it didn't help. He leaned against the brick wall of the building, taking deep, shaky breaths. He pulled out his phone, his hands trembling so badly he almost dropped it. He needed to call his partner. He needed to call his lawyer. He needed to do something, anything, to fix this. But as he stared at the screen, he realized that this couldn't be fixed with a phone call. He hadn't just lost a loan. He had lost the respect of the most powerful man in the city. And deep down, in a dark corner of his mind that he tried to ignore, he knew that Mr. Sterling was right. He was a bully. He was cruel. And today, for the first time in his life, he had to face the consequences of being the person he chose to be. He looked down the street and saw Mr. Sterling and Alina walking away. They were walking slowly, talking, and laughing. They looked happy. They looked rich in a way that Thomas, with all his money and his fancy suits, had never been. Thomas put his phone in his pocket and turned in the opposite direction. Walking away with his head down, feeling smaller and poorer than he had ever felt in his life, the city moved on around him, busy and loud. But for Thomas, the world had stopped moving. The morning air felt different now. It wasn't the crisp, promising air of a new day filled with potential. It felt heavy, damp, and cold against Thomas's skin. He walked briskly, trying to put distance between himself and the coffee shop. But no matter how fast he walked, the scene played over and over in his mind like a movie he couldn't turn off. He saw Mr. Sterling's cold eyes. He heard the silence of the room, and he felt the sting of Elena's indifference. He turned a corner, half expecting to wake up in his bed. For this all to be a nightmare caused by eating something spicy before sleep. But the honking of the cars and the hard pavement under his expensive shoes told him this was brutally real. He stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, and caught his own reflection in a shop window. The man staring back looked like a stranger. The suit was still sharp, the watch still glittered in the sunlight, but the face behind it was pale and defeated. The arrogance that usually tightened his jaw was gone, replaced by a slack look of panic. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The vibration made him jump. He pulled it out, hoping it wasn't a notification from his banking app or an email from Mr. Sterling's secretary. It was a text from his business partner, David. * meeting at the office at 10. Don't be late. The Sterling contract is finally ready for review. * Thomas stared at the letters on the screen. They blurred together for a moment. The Sterling contract. It didn't exist anymore. The deal was dead. He typed out a reply with shaking thumbs, his fingers slipping on the glass. * meeting cancelled. We have a problem. A big problem? ***. What kind of problem? David texted back instantly. **, just get to the office. I'll be there. **. Thomas slipped the phone back into his pocket. He had to face David. He had to face his team. He had to tell them that the deal they had spent 6 months working on, the deal that was supposed to save their company, was gone. Because he couldn't keep his mouth shut and couldn't control his temper in a coffee line, the ride up the elevator to his office was the longest ride of his life. Usually, he stood in the middle of the car, checking his teeth in the reflection, mentally preparing to give orders. Today he stood in the corner, staring at the floor numbers lighting up one by one. He prayed the elevator would just get stuck or that the cables would snap. Anything to delay the inevitable. But the doors slid open smoothly on the 20th floor. The receptionist looked up and smiled. Good morning, Mr. Thomas. You have a few messages? Not now, Jessica, he mumbled, brushing past her desk without making eye contact. He walked into his corner office. It was a beautiful room with a view of the entire skyline. He had furnished it with the best leather chairs and a mahogany desk that cost more than most cars. This was his kingdom. This was where he felt safe. But today, the room felt hollow. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was accusatory. David was already waiting inside, pacing back and forth. When he saw Thomas, he stopped. What's going on? Why did you cancel the meeting with Sterling's lawyers? They were waiting for us. Thomas walked over to the window and looked out at the city he had always wanted to conquer. He saw the cranes, the buildings, the millions of people going about their lives. He felt incredibly small. The deal is off, David, Thomas said, his voice sounding hollow. It's over. What do you mean it's over? David yelled, his face turning red. We are signing the papers today. We need that money. Aren't getting the money, Thomas said, turning around. And we aren't getting the meeting. Why? Did they change their mind about the numbers? Did they find a better offer? Thomas took a deep breath. He couldn't lie. Not to David. Not after everything. No, it was me. What? I was at the coffee shop near the bank this morning, Thomas started. He couldn't even say the words out loud at first. He felt like he was confessing to a crime. Mr. Sterling was there. And his daughter. David stared at him, confused. So you met him? That's great. You should have charmed him. I didn't know it was him, Thomas said, his voice trembling. I made a scene, David. There was a woman in line. Simple clothes. She was paying with change. I yelled at her. I told her she didn't belong there. I told her to leave. The room went dead silent. David stopped pacing. He just looked at Thomas, his eyes wide with disbelief. You yelled at a woman in a coffee shop? David asked slowly. While you were waiting for the biggest meeting of your life, I didn't know who she was. Thomas shouted, defensiveness rising in his chest, though he knew it was useless. She looked poor, David. I was just trying to keep the line moving. I wanted to make sure we weren't late. David walked over to the desk and leaned on it, dropping his head into his hands. Oh my God. Please tell me you're joking. I'm not, Thomas whispered. Mr. Sterling walked in right after. He saw the whole thing. He introduced himself as her father. He called me a pig in silk. Thomas let out a short, bitter laugh. She said that too. Her exact words. David stood up straight. He looked at Thomas with a mixture of pity and anger that was worse than pure hatred. "You have humiliated us, Thomas. You didn't just lose a loan. You have made us look like fools in front of the most powerful bank in the city. Do you think he's going to stop there? He's going to talk. Other investors will hear about this. Nobody is going to want to touch us." "I know," Thomas said, sinking into his leather chair. It didn't feel comfortable anymore. It felt like a trap. "I know." "You have to fix this," David said, grabbing his coat. "You have to go apologize. You have to beg." "I already tried," Thomas said, staring at the ceiling. "He told me character is constant. He said my behavior was ugly." David shook his head. "I can't believe this. All that work, gone, because you're a bully." He walked to the door, then stopped and looked back. "I'm going to try to save the company, Thomas, but I don't know if I can. And frankly, I don't know if I want to work with a man like you." David walked out and closed the door softly. Thomas sat in the silence for a long time. He watched the clouds move over the city. He realized then that he had spent his entire life building a house of cards. He had built his reputation on fear and arrogance, thinking it made him strong. But today, a stiff breeze had blown through, and the whole thing had collapsed. He wasn't strong. He was weak. He was the kind of man who yelled at women in coffee shops to feel big. A week passed. Thomas didn't go into the office. He couldn't face the staff. He heard through the grapevine that David was stepping down to take a job at a different firm, and that 3 major investors had pulled out of other projects, citing personal differences. The domino effect was real. The city's business community was small, and news traveled fast. Thomas was becoming a pariah. He spent his days sitting in his apartment, looking at the view. He tried to call Mr. Sterling's office a dozen times, but the secretary would always put him on hold and then disconnect him. He wrote a letter, a long, rambling apology, but he never sent it. What was the point? 2 weeks later, Thomas decided he needed coffee. Not the fancy stuff from the shop where his life had ended. Just a regular coffee from a street cart. He put on a baseball cap and sunglasses, hoping not to be recognized. He felt like a celebrity in hiding. But for all the wrong reasons, he walked to the park near his building and sat on a wooden bench. It was a crisp afternoon. The park was full of people walking dogs, playing with children, and enjoying the day. Thomas sat there, sipping his paper cup of coffee, feeling invisible. He watched a young mother nearby struggling to open a stroller while holding a toddler's hand. Without thinking, Thomas stood up. He walked over to her. "Here, let me help you with that," he said. The mother looked up, startled. She saw a man in an expensive coat under the baseball cap, but his eyes looked tired and kind. "Oh, thank you," she said. Thomas snapped the stroller open and stepped back. "No problem. It's stubborn today," she said with a smile. "They can be," Thomas said. He looked at the toddler, who was looking up at him. "Have a good day, you too," the mother said. Thomas walked back to his bench. It was a small thing. A tiny interaction. He hadn't saved a company or made $1 million, but as he sat down he felt a small warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. He realized that Alina had given him something, even though she didn't mean to. She had held up a mirror. She had shown him the truth. He wasn't poor because he lost his money. He was poor because he had forgotten how to be a human being. And maybe, just maybe, if he started doing small acts of kindness, if he started treating people like they mattered, he could start to rebuild what he had broken. He might never get the skyscraper. He might never get Mr. Sterling's approval. But sitting there in the park, watching the leaves rustle in the wind, Thomas finally understood that there were things much more valuable than being the richest man in the room. He took a sip of his cheap coffee, and for the first time in his life, he thought it tasted just right.